Harriet stands before the lakeside cottage, the early morning light casting a soft glow over the tranquil scene. As she gazes at the familiar yet distant place, emotions of nostalgia and uncertainty blend into the peaceful, reflective setting. Sometimes, when we think we've left behind the places that shaped us, we discover that they're still woven into the fabric of who we are. For Harriet and Wynne, their happy place is a sprawling, sun-soaked cottage by the shore, filled with memories of a time when everything felt simple. But coming back here now feels like the start of a slow unraveling, as they're faced with ghosts of what was, and the lingering hope of what could still be. Chapter 1. Returning to the cottage. Harriet hadn't set foot in the cottage for 3 years. Yet, as she stood before it, the sight hit her with a force she wasn't prepared for. The whitewashed walls, the sloping roof, and the large bay window overlooking the lake brought back every memory she'd been trying to avoid. She could hear the laughter from long summer nights, the gentle splash of the lake against the dock, and, most painfully, Wynne's voice calling out to her, teasing her with affection only they understood. She had believed that leaving this place behind would mean leaving him behind, too, but standing here now, it felt like he was still here, in every creak of the wooden floor and every echo of the wind through the trees. Harriet and Wynne stand side by side on the porch at sunset, their unresolved emotions hanging in the air. The warmth of the setting sun contrasts with the tension between them. She'd come back for Sabrina. Sabrina had been relentless, insisting that the whole group get together for one last summer at the cottage, as if they could somehow recapture the magic that had faded. They had been the perfect group once: Harriet, Wynne, Sabrina, Parth, Cleo, and Kimmy. Now, things were frayed, held together by strings of memories and the facade of friendships that had changed in ways they didn't like to acknowledge. Chapter 2. The group reunites. Sabrina was the first to arrive, her loud laugh filling the space as she hugged Harriet tightly, too tightly. She always did that, like she was trying to fuse everyone back together through sheer force of will. Parth followed close behind, carrying their luggage and wearing his familiar easy-going grin. Cleo arrived next, her sharp gaze taking everything in, always the one to see too much, to know too much. Harriet waited for Wynne to walk through the door, bracing herself for the inevitable flood of emotions, but it wasn't Wynne who walked in next. It was Kimmy, bouncing in with her usual boundless energy. Harriet couldn't help but smile. Kimmy had always been the heart of the group, the one who believed in happy endings when the rest of them had grown too cynical. Still, there was a tension in the air, an unspoken understanding that this wasn't the same. Their group had cracks in it now, and Harriet wasn't sure if they were there to fix them or to finally acknowledge them. When Wynne finally arrived, Harriet felt the air shift. He was quieter than she remembered, more reserved. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and Harriet wondered if he felt the same weight pressing down on him that she did. They hadn't spoken since the breakup, and now, facing him again, Harriet wasn't sure if she was ready for this. Chapter 3. Reconnecting. The first few days passed in a blur of activity. They went out on the lake, lounged on the dock, and shared meals that felt like old times. But underneath the laughter, there was something brittle, something fragile about the way they interacted. Harriet noticed the way Wynne avoided looking at her for too long, the way his hand twitched as if he wanted to reach out to her but didn't. She noticed the way Sabrina and Parth exchanged tense glances, as if they were holding onto a secret they couldn't share. And Cleo was watching them all with that same sharp gaze, like she was waiting for the moment everything would shatter. Harriet sits quietly on the dock at night, the moonlight reflecting off the lake. The peaceful yet melancholic scene mirrors her internal contemplation. One night, after a particularly long dinner, Harriet found herself alone on the porch, staring out at the lake. The moonlight reflected off the water, turning it into a silver sheet. It was beautiful, but it was also achingly familiar. She could almost hear the echo of Wynne's voice beside her, telling her how much he loved this place, how much he loved her. She didn't hear Wynne approach until he was standing next to her. His presence was so familiar, so solid, that it took all her strength not to lean into him. They stood in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of their unspoken words hanging between them. Chapter 4. Truths Uncovered. As the days passed, the cracks in their group began to widen. Harriet couldn't ignore the way Sabrina and Parth were drifting apart, or the way Cleo seemed more distant than usual. Even Kimmy's endless optimism was starting to falter. Around the fire pit, the group of friends wrestles with their changing relationships. The warmth of the flames contrasts with the tension in their conversations, as each grapples with unspoken truths. It all came to a head one evening when they were sitting around the fire, the air thick with tension. Harriet could feel it building, the way a storm does before it finally breaks. And when it did, it wasn't in the way she had expected. Sabrina was the one who broke first. "We can't keep pretending everything's the same," she said, her voice trembling. "We're not the same people we were when we started coming here." Harriet watched as Parth's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "You're right," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "But maybe we don't have to be." For a moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled in the silence, the only sound breaking the tension between them. Chapter 5. A New Beginning. The next morning, Harriet woke up before anyone else. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden glow over the lake. She sat on the edge of the dock, her feet dangling in the water, and let herself breathe. As dawn breaks, Harriet and Wynne sit side by side on the dock, watching the sun rise. The serene scene reflects their bittersweet contemplation of what lies ahead. She wasn't sure what would happen with the group, or with Wynne, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't keep holding on to the past. This place, as beautiful as it was, wasn't the same without the people who had made it special. And if they couldn't find a way to move forward together, then maybe it was time to let go. Wynne joined her on the dock a few moments later, sitting down beside her without saying a word. They didn't need to speak, their silence was enough. They both knew that this was their last summer at the cottage, their last chance to figure out what came next. And maybe, just maybe, that was okay. They sat together, watching the sunrise, and for the first time in a long time, Harriet felt at peace. Whatever happened next, she would be okay. They all would. Epilogue. Moving on. By the time they all packed up and left the cottage, there was a quiet understanding between them. Things wouldn't be the same, but that didn't mean they were broken. They were different people now, and that was okay. As Harriet drove away from the cottage, she glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The whitewashed walls and the sloping roof disappeared from view, but the memories stayed with her. She wasn't sure if she'd ever come back, but she knew one thing: the cottage would always be her happy place, no matter where life took her.